Hello everyone, welcome to some more tasty Tuesday nutrition information. I've started a little series, as you might remember, on world cuisine. I did a general overview a couple of weeks ago, and then last week we looked at the Mediterranean diet and we summarised a few points of what people in the Mediterranean tend to eat. Why is that good? So if you haven't seen it, you can watch it on this same site, community page. And today I want to home in on even more specific now. So we've looked at a general, we've looked at a region, the Mediterranean, and today I want to look at the place of, that's right, France. So obviously France is a big country. I'm not trying to teach you to suck eggs here. I'm sure you all know what France looks like. A lot of it here down on the Mediterranean. I'm not suggesting French people all eat the same diet. They don't. But there are some general concepts of French cuisine, which I'm sure you've come across if you've ever visited France, particularly if you've been out in the rural regions, not so much the big cities. The things you've found, the things you've eaten, etc. So I'm just going to summarise a little bit here about French cuisine. And if we start off from the earliest point of life, so as a baby, babies are generally weaned in France onto things like vegetable soups. So they're introduced to flavours and different textures very early on. Whereas maybe you could think about in Britain, for instance, well, when I was a baby, I should imagine I was fed something like Farley's rusk, which maybe you were as well. So generally in Britain, we're more weaned onto cereal products, but in France it seems to be a much more weaning onto, well, vegetables in some kind of format, which is maybe why in France there's less of a stigma, particularly for males, eating vegetables. Interesting. So, as I say, children are exposed therefore to tastes, textures, flavours, combinations of tastes very early on to a very big variety of vegetables, which then passes through all of their lifestyle. So that's the first thing, probably a lot of different variation from a very young age. The French diet's often summed up like this: the small portions of high quality food less often. High quality food, but it's less often. So therefore there's a lot of flavour and there's high satisfaction. So they feel sated a lot quicker. Now, don't get me wrong, the French love their food, but not in the same way, for example, as maybe Americans love their food, or maybe even British people love their food, should I say. Because in the West, we often confuse enjoyment of food with overconsumption. We get that thing, don't we? We've all been to the cafe or the restaurant. You're full up, you can't squeeze another thing in, and somebody says to you, "Have you seen what's on the dessert menu?" And you go, "No." "Why? What's on it?" And they say, "Well, I've seen it's death by chocolate or that chocolate brownie." And you go, "No way, I'm having one." To which they might say, "I thought you were full up." But we can always squeeze one in. That probably wouldn't happen as much in France in the general eating pattern, because they wouldn't get to that point of overconsumption. Generally in France, 3 leisurely meals, and that's an important word, isn't it there? Leisurely. They don't grab a quick sandwich, rush it down, get heartburn, and straight back to the office or whatever they're doing. It's a very gentle, even their fast food, in general, is eaten more calmly, leisurely, enjoyed. So that's maybe an interesting point. They also tend to shun, a lot more than we do, processed food. So they're much more likely to cook things from scratch. Not saying that we don't. In Britain, we probably do, a lot of us. But they're less likely to go to packet meals, ready meals, not all the time, but some of the time. So meals are a priority. So you'll generally find most French families, particularly out more in the villages and the smaller towns, they're eating at a table. They're not all lined up on the settee with a ready meal, getting ready for a night's viewing. They're sat at the table engaging conversation and thinking about what they're eating. Now, some interesting research as well, that we've noticed that families in the UK who eat dinner together tend to eat more vegetables, fruit, less fried food, less processed food, less sugar. So that's interesting, isn't it? So if you can make the effort to maybe eat somewhere else rather than the television, I'm not saying that's wrong, but maybe that could be a starting point. So that's something else. Now, the staple foods in France might go something like this: full fat cheese, yogurt, bread, vegetables, fruits, butter, some meat, smaller amount, but maybe more fish, chicken, etc. Wine, often red wine, dark chocolates. So not necessarily a carbon copy of the Mediterranean diet. And this is why in nutrition we've often homed in on France, and we've coined a phrase for the French that's called the French paradox. You may have heard of that. And it's basically, why is it that as a population they do eat a lot of saturated fat? I mentioned the full fat cheese there, I mentioned a lot of butter they're consuming, etc. But not a huge amount of coronary heart disease, obesity, type 2 diabetes in general. And so there's probably some more going on than we realise in the diet, because the French are consuming quite a lot of saturated fat. And they're not alone. In Holland it's similar, a similar paradox that we see as well. Now, French people in general are not swayed by conflicting media advice around nutrition and food. Their advice will generally come from their parents, their grandparents, and they don't seem to have that fear of a bad report coming out about their foods. So it's easier in that way for them to eat smaller amounts of maybe not such good foods without feeling guilty. So that's quite an important point. So their nutrition knowledge or foundation is coming definitely from their parents and their grandparents, and that's quite a strong foundation because it's not going to be rocked by what the 6 o'clock news says. So that's quite a good terminology there. So what are there a couple of things we can say in this short video about the French cuisine? Well, number one, they do tend to snack smart. French people in generally aren't huge snackers. And if they do snack, they don't tend to go for biscuits, club wafer bars, caramel bars, whatever. They tend to go for things like maybe a bit of bread, some cheese, a bit of yogurt, fruit, that sort of thing. So that's a bit of a smarter choice that they're making. It's more proteinous, generally more fibre in there, so it's going to fill them up, and it's not going to wreck their blood sugars over the day, whereas a lot of the time in the West we can ride the roller coaster of blood sugar. The second point, which I'm sure you're all itching to ask me, is, yeah, but French people drink a lot of red wine, Marco. That's true. They do drink as a nation quite a bit of red wine, but they tend to enjoy smaller portions of red wine with food. You don't tend to see them drinking that much wine away from food. So yes, they may have 1 or 2 glasses of wine with their food, but they're not drinking 1 or 2 bottles. Big difference. So why would the red wine maybe be beneficial? For them as a nation, possibly some of the qualities, particularly of red wine, we know there's some strong antioxidants in there that can be quite cardioprotective of their arterial walls, for example. So that could be one of the reasons. We know the French also do eat a lot, consume a lot of olive oil, extra virgin olive oil as well as the other foods I've mentioned. But yeah, they're big drinkers. I mean, we'll put the kettle on, probably, like they might go for red wine. So they're not over-consuming, but they're eating it in the right format, generally at meal times. The third thing I was just going to mention is dessert. So we all like to squeeze in, well, we don't all like to, but some of us like to have maybe a nice chocolatey, sugary, sweet dessert. Whereas in France, they don't tend to finish a meal stuffed and really full, which gives them a chance to maybe have some full fat cheese, maybe some rich dark chocolate, maybe some fruit. But generally they're not eating things like apple crumble and custard, chocolate sponge and custard, highly sugary yogurts, that kind of thing. If they're eating yogurt, it's generally plain and they're adding their own fruit to it. So I know that's been quite a general guide through, and I know there's many different recipes in France for all kinds of foods. I mean, this is like a culinary centre of the world, isn't it? French cuisine. And I'm sure you've got a lot of favourites. Maybe it's something simple like French onion soup, or maybe it's something like the moules marinières with the mussels. It could be any kind of thing. But generally in France, we see, particularly in the villages and the towns, a healthier consumption, more fruit, more vegetables, more time in eating it, more eating it as a family, introducing fruit, vegetable to quite young children. As soon as they start to be weaned, they're on things like thick vegetable soup very early on, as opposed to cereal products. They are drinking red wine, but with meals. They are eating full fat products, but in the right context. And they're snacking smart. So maybe there's a few things there from the French cuisine that maybe you could think about for your own diet, perhaps. Try maybe one or two of them out. Maybe have a search for some French recipes online. We're not suggesting that the French diet is all spot on, brilliant, fantastic. We're not saying that. We're just saying, as a cuisine, it does have a lot of qualities. And it's not just the food, notice what I said earlier, it's also the way they eat food. As a family, they take their time. A big problem I come across with people often in the UK, we ram our food down quick, then we get heartburn, then we go to the Gaviscon or the Rennie, and we're not sure why that is. Remember, if you eat food when you're stressed out, the food will remain in your stomach and your gut, and it will just sit there repeating. So if you're really stressed, my advice might be probably best not to eat, or don't eat too much. So I hope you've enjoyed that little bit on French cuisine, and till next time, happy and healthy eating, and bye bye for now.